We get order? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Speaker, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Foreign Affairs be discharged from further consideration of House Concurrent Resolution 92, and I ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 92, a concurrent resolution recognizing the deep and abiding friendship between the United States and Israel.
Is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Royce of California, page 3, line 3, strike, without prejudice to the rights of all people to live within or alongside Israel in peace, and insert that upholds full and equal rights for all of its citizens.
Without objection, the amendment is agreed to, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 619, I call up the bill H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 302, H.R. 1, a bill to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2018.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 619, in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-39 is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill shall be debated for 4 hours, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, will each control 2 hours. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill currently under consideration.
Without objection. So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, could you call the House to order?
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. I ask the members to take their conversations outside. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today the full House begins consideration of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, historic tax reform legislation that will revitalize our economy and provide lasting tax relief to Americans of all walks of life. Over 30 years have gone by since the last overhaul of our nation's tax system. And in that time, our tax codes become one of the most complicated, unfair, and uncompetitive in the world. And today it's impacting nearly every aspect of Americans' lives, and not for the better. The overwhelming complexity of today's system forces American taxpayers to spend billions of hours and billions of dollars every year just filing their taxes. Trillions of dollars of carve-outs and loopholes give favoritism to Washington's special interests, while hardworking Americans get nothing but frustration.
The gentleman continue.
And with some of the highest tax rates in the world for our businesses, we're seeing good-paying American jobs in manufacturing plants move overseas, one after the other. Today, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we change all of this. With this bill, we have an opportunity to deliver the most transformational tax overhaul in a generation. But make no mistake, this bill is not about us. It's not about Congress. This bill is about, for the first time in decades, providing the American people with a simple and fair tax system. So much so, 9 out of 10 Americans will be able to file using a simple postcard-style system. It's about finally rewarding hard work, growing jobs and paychecks, and allowing Americans to keep more of their hard-earned money to use on whatever is important to them. So if you're one of the millions of Americans who is sick of today's tax code, you're going to see a remarkable difference. You'll see a standard deduction doubled, increasing to protect more of every paycheck from taxes. You'll have a larger child tax credit, providing more support as you raise a family and care for your loved ones. And more Americans will get help raising their kids. You'll have peace of mind when it comes to some of life's most important investments, because this bill preserves tax benefits to help you afford your home, to pay your property taxes, and put your kids through college. So if you're a typical middle-income family of 4, making $59,000 a year, you're going to get a tax cut of nearly $1,200. More than that, you're going to enjoy the benefits of a strong, healthy, and growing American economy. You're going to see more jobs on Main Street. With this bill, our small businesses will finally have low tax rates and a fair tax code that works with them as they grow and create jobs. You're going to see our larger businesses, our iconic American brands, and our major manufacturers win throughout the world and create new, good-paying jobs right here at home. Because with this bill, we're going to have one of the most modern and one of the most competitive tax codes on the planet. That includes lowering our corporate rate from 35% to 20%, which beats many of our international competitors. And not only are you going to see jobs stop leaving the United States, you're going to see our nation become a 21st century magnet for job creation and business investment. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you, the American people, will see and help lead the way in launching a new era of Made in America innovation. In the end, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is a striking alternative to the broken tax code we have today. Represents a bold path forward that will allow us, as a country, to break out of the slow growth status quo once and for all. Mr. Speaker, the American people have waited years, decades, for a fair, simple, and competitive tax code. Right now, in this moment, we stand on the doorstep of delivering the most sweeping tax overhaul since President Reagan's reforms in 1986. And like President Reagan back then, President Trump is now putting his full support behind this effort. Let's pass this historic bill and take another step forward in delivering bold, pro-growth, pro-family tax reform for Americans throughout this nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted the chairman mentioned President Reagan, but he made it sound as though President Reagan did tax reform on his own. Tax reform in 1986 was done in a bipartisan manner. I guess we just leave out Speaker O'Neill, and we just leave out Chairman Rostenkowski, or we just leave out Senator Bradley or Congressman Gephardt. And the reason that they're left out is because even though it was accomplished in 86, it started in 82, when Mr. Gephardt and Mr. Bradley introduced the first Tax Reform Act. So what happened in those intervening years? Well, the Ways and Means Committee took testimony from 450 witnesses. They held 30 markups, untold number of hearings. Now contrast that with what we did in the Ways and Means Committee. Not one witness, not one hearing, not one opportunity to hear from renowned economists, renowned labor leaders, or individuals who would have great knowledge, not just of what happened in '86, but what could happen in this chamber. And instead, we're going forward with this ill-considered effort, and this is a missed opportunity. This is a bad deal for millions of Americans in the middle class. The legislation puts the wealthy, the well-connected, and the strong once again at the top. 36 million Americans are going to receive a tax increase. When they talk about tax simplification, take a look at the phase-ins and the phase-outs of this measure. That's hardly simplification, it's greater complexity. Oh, and by the way, the corporate rate is made permanent. The individual issues phase out after 5 years. Consider this. 13 million people will lose their health insurance based upon what Republicans are doing in the United States Senate. They're going to lose their health care to pay for a tax cut for people at the very top. Now, let me just walk you through some of these provisions because I think that they deserve our attention and the magnifying glass of critical analysis. So we are being asked tonight to borrow $2.3 trillion to pay for this tax cut. These are from people who regularly lecture the American electorate on the need for fiscal austerity and balanced budgets. When Barack Obama's president, the budget should be balanced. When Bill Clinton is president, the budget should be balanced. But in the intervening period of time, apparently, we don't have to balance the budget. $2.3 trillion is being added to the debt and deficits. So we are witnessing what they are attempting to do because they're going to scale back the tax benefit for buying a new home by lowering the cap on mortgage interest deduction to $500,000. That is going to lower home values. H.R. 1 repeals the new markets tax credits. The historic tax credit, which has transformed American cities, is being eliminated. They beat up the municipal bond market. As a former mayor, I have some knowledge of the municipal bond market because they're getting rid of the private activity bonds. I, years ago, raised the cap so that we might do more intervention and innovation in terms of rebuilding our airports across the country. Private activity bonds are a key for financing affordable housing, and it's going to go by the wayside if they have their way. It's going to have a profound impact on the housing market. They eliminate several deductions and exclusions that help students pay for their college education, including a deduction for interest on student loans. Pay attention to this number. Student debt in America is at $1.3 trillion, and they're taking away the ability of students to deduct that interest on those loans. And they impose a new tax on universities and colleges. They repeal the above-the-line deduction for teachers' out-of-pocket expenses. You know those teachers who are good enough in September because they might be short some school supplies? They pack the car up and bring it to school, and we give them a $250 deduction, and they're going to take it away. They create a health tax, an Alzheimer's tax, by repealing the medical expense deduction. This change basically scraps a family's ability to receive financial relief when dealing with serious medical conditions. So think of it this way. We celebrate annually increases in life expectancy in America. 80 for a male, 81 for a female. But if we're going to celebrate that, we also have to acknowledge something else, more dementia and more Alzheimer's as people grow older in America. So their decision, let's take away the ability of individuals to deduct those expenses. They also want to write off a very important consideration for the middle class and their ability to deduct real property tax costs up to $10,000. Now contrast this with what these tax cuts do for the wealthy. H.R. 1 repeals the estate tax, which is paid by that number of families in America. They're going to repeal it. I guess the slogan becomes, we're rich and we're not going to take it anymore. That's not a tax on Conrad Hilton, it's a tax on Paris Hilton. And that's what we should be considering with greater efforts on their side to further concentrate wealth. And by the way, an issue I have worked on for decades here successfully, because 27 million middle-class families no longer pay alternative minimum tax, but guess what they're going to do? They're going to eliminate it now for 4.5 of the richest families in America. They're going to take away that payment. This is a missed opportunity, Mr. Speaker. This could have been done the way Chairman Brady indicated in 1986. Hearings, markups, a genuine effort to find common ground on this. On our side, I've waited all these years to do this, and tonight what you're witnessing, and tomorrow, they need a victory. That's what this is about. It's a victory in search of a policy, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr.
Mr.
Brady.
Speaker, I'll yield myself 10 seconds. I'll note that a good friend from Massachusetts in his district, the average family of 4 making $87,000 will see a tax cut of $2,032. I'm pleased now to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Tax Policy Subcommittee and a leader in this tax reform effort, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscom.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Brady. Mr. Speaker, my friend from Massachusetts said this was a missed opportunity. This is no missed opportunity. What we're witnessing is the seizing of an opportunity. During the debate, our friends on the other side of the aisle, in 25 hours of markup last week, offered amendment after amendment after amendment. I think it was about 25 amendments. And you know what every one of the amendments did, Mr. Speaker? Restored the status quo. Put something back in, put another thing back in, defend something else, and so forth. There was no comprehensive offer of an amendment in the nature of the substitute that would have been transformational. There's no exclusion here. We debated, we are now here, and for the first time since 1986, we're on the cusp of seizing an opportunity and having a transformational moment. And here's the transformation. When the tax code was last created, last amended 30 years ago, think about it. The internet didn't exist as a commercial enterprise, and yet it has fully developed. And we've got a tax code that was built for yesterday. The global nature of supply chains, they were nowhere nearly as intricately interlinked, and yet we've got a tax code that was built for yesterday. The shared economy, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, all of those things, they didn't exist. And yet we've got an economy that was built, we've got a tax code that was built for yesterday. Who does the status quo benefit, Mr. Speaker? It benefits the few. It benefits the privileged. It benefits the folks at the top of the economic scale of things. And so what this is doing is it's proposing a very different approach. It says we're going to make the United States the most competitive jurisdiction in the world by giving business tax relief and welcoming back commercial enterprise and growth and prosperity and ingenuity and investment that does what? It creates paychecks and it expands opportunities. Kids graduating from college shouldn't have to grub around piecing together 2 jobs and living in their parents' basement? How absurd. We can do much better. We're the biggest, best economy in the world, and it's time we acted like it. This is transformational. And to lean back and away from this and say, oh, this tax code is a natural disaster that is just too big and it's too overwhelming that we can't deal with, nonsense. We fundamentally reject that. We're going to be measured in the future, Mr. Speaker, by this moment. And I want to thank Chairman Brady for his leadership in creating this crescendo, because now is the time to act. Let's not defend the status quo. Let's move forward and let's transform this economy. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am for maintaining the status quo by allowing students to deduct their student interest loans. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Congresswoman Schakowsky.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Everyone knows that the Republican tax scam gives massive tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires and corporations, and they do it in part by increasing health care costs for millions of Americans. Overall 36 million middle-class households will see a tax hike under this bill. Families with big medical bills will take the hardest hit. That's because Americans will no longer be able to deduct major medical expenses such as cancer treatment or Alzheimer's from their federal income taxes. This is a middle-class tax hike. 7 in 10 households using the medical expense deduction make under $75,000 a year, and repealing the deduction would especially hurt seniors who use it for long-term care expenses. The bill takes a second swipe at American seniors and people with disabilities. According to the Congressional Budget Office, by not paying for tax cuts for the wealthy, Republicans would trigger automatic cuts to Medicare, slashing $25 billion from Medicare in 2018 alone. But the $25 billion cut to Medicare is just the beginning. The same Republican budget that cleared the way for a $1.1 trillion in tax cuts for the super wealthy proposed cutting Medicare and Medicaid, by no coincidence, by $1.5 trillion. And now Senate Republicans want to pay for additional tax cuts by repealing a key part of the Affordable Care Act. This change would increase the number of uninsured Americans by 13 million and increase premiums by 10%. Middle-class families, people with disabilities, seniors struggling to afford health care should not foot the bill for billionaires to get a tax cut. I urge my colleagues to make the healthy choice for Americans and vote against the Republican tax scam. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really honored to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee and a champion for working families, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Reichert.
The gentleman is recognized.
Chairman, for yielding, and thank him for his leadership and bringing this tough piece of legislation. Tough, I mean only in the sense that it has taken years to put this together, and at least 40 hearings on the legislation that's presented today. So, Mr. Speaker, when I travel my district from the suburbs of Auburn, Washington to the orchards of Chelan, I hear the same thing from middle-income, hard-working families, from the apple grower in Wenatchee, the tech entrepreneur in Issaquah, and a growing family in Maple Valley, Washington. They want to keep more of their hard-earned money. They plan for the future. They want to plan even more. They want to have some certainty in their future. And they want to care for those they love. They deserve a plan that gives them the opportunity at their first job or a better job. And they deserve a chance to decide how they want to spend their money. It's their money. Why wouldn't they deserve that chance? They want a tax code that's simpler, fairer, and that works for them. And they want the same bright future for their children. This is a bill that's not just a tax bill, but it's a bill that reignites, in my opinion, the belief in the American dream. In the 8th District of Washington State, the median income family of 4 will receive a tax cut of $3,654. And in Washington State, 21,875 new jobs will be created. This plan will change lives. It'll energize our economy and get our economy booming again. Now, as we went through this process, I asked myself several questions over the last few years, to be honest with you. Here are the questions. Will this plan make the American economy boom again? Will this plan create jobs in America? Will this plan increase paychecks? Will this plan put more money in the pockets of hard-working Americans? And will this plan make the tax code fairer and simpler? And the answer I came to, and I think that Americans will come to, Mr. Speaker, the answer is a resounding yes. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this bill phases out the deductions that benefit middle-income families. And with that, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois for 2 minutes, Mr. Schneider.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We absolutely must reform our outdated and overly complex tax code. But the current bill this House is considering is not the way to do it. I've heard from constituents and local elected officials about how this plan will hurt them and their communities. Rather than lifting our economy and making our local communities stronger, this bill before us is an unfair and fiscally reckless step backwards. My constituents are deeply concerned with the restrictions placed on the state and local tax or SALT deduction. This puts a real burden on the residents of states like Illinois. 1 in 3 Illinois taxpayers uses the SALT deduction. Let's be clear. The SALT deduction is not a tax break for the very wealthy. It's used by the hardworking American families we need to be helping with tax reform, not hurting. I'm also profoundly concerned about what this reform means for our growing debt. An additional $2.3 trillion in debt is irresponsible in the extreme, burdening our children and our grandchildren with the consequences. And now, with the most recent Senate version, the GOP is taking aim at the Affordable Care Act, repealing the individual mandate without a workable replacement to further reduce enrollment in the individual health insurance markets, making coverage more expensive for millions of Americans and their families. There are things we can do to improve the ACA. For example, delaying the looming taxes on medical devices and health insurance premiums has broad bipartisan support. We should be focused on solutions like these that improve, not dismantle the ACA. But despite our willingness to work across the aisle, there was virtually no bipartisan engagement on the plan this House is rushing to vote on. But it's not too late to change course. I urge my colleagues to take the time for full deliberation in a complete and bipartisan process. Together, we can produce real tax reform that is fiscally responsible, prioritizes the middle class, and grows our economy for the next generation. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Human Resources Subcommittee and champion for agriculture, a gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman Brady, thank you for the time and for your leadership as we continue our efforts to pass this historic legislation. Mr. Speaker, after nearly 7 years of work in the Ways and Means Committee and more than 31 years since our last true tax reform, many hearings along the way, it is time to pass historic comprehensive tax reform. Our current tax code is antiquated, as we know. It's complex, and it ignores many of the improvements in competitiveness which have been adopted by every other major economy worldwide. The time for tax reform is now. Others have already outlined many of the highlights of this bill, but I think they warrant mentioning again. Simplified compliance and rates for individuals and families means more than 95% of Americans will be able to file their returns on a postcard. Lower rates for small businesses recognize the important role they play as job creators in our economy. A 20% top corporate tax rate and transitioning to a territorial system will ensure our businesses remain competitive with the rest of the world. In addition to lower rates, expanded expensing will further encourage entrepreneurs to invest in capital to grow their businesses. And full repeal of the death tax, including the continuation of stepped-up basis, will ensure our nation's farmers, ranchers, and small manufacturers can continue creating opportunity for generations to come without the threat of double taxation. Our tax code shouldn't reward businesses and investors because they hired accountants and lawyers to help them avoid taxes, and the estate tax does exactly that right now. I think it is equally important to praise what the bill leaves alone in the tax code. With our impending entitlement crisis, we want Americans to save everything they can for retirement. This bill leaves those incentives intact. It also excludes a proposal which had initially been included in the bill to apply self-employment taxes to rental income. This could have had serious repercussions for ag land rental, and I'm glad it was dropped. And I particularly appreciate how this bill continues the deductibility of state and local taxes for businesses, including farmers and ranchers. U.S. producers have made great strides in increasing production on a per-acre basis, but land remains a primary input as they work to feed the world. Ensuring the property tax on land in production remains deductible as a business cost is vital to their continued success. This is the moment to finally provide the tax relief Americans have been asking for and to make our country competitive again. I urge the passage of this pro-growth bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 100,000 Nebraska households making under $137,000 a year will see a tax increase under this bill. With that, my really good friend from Somerville, Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano is recognized for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Guys, I'm a former tax lawyer. My wife is a practicing CPA. We've heard this before. Simplification is going to help. It has never put a single accountant out of business, and it won't do it now. It is another part of the big scam going on. Why? Sure, I'll probably get a tax break out of this. Some of my constituents will. But what do we get in return? We don't get health care. We don't get better roads. We don't get better education. But we do provide a $5,000 to $10,000 debt for our children. We do tell our seniors, too bad if you have a heart attack or cancer, no more medical deduction for you. We tell our current graduate students, too bad, no deductions for you, and on and on and on. And by the way, we have a new provision in here that I like to call the Dynasty Protection Act. Why? Because if you have a dynasty, if you are worth $30, $40, $50, $100 million, your children get to keep it all. Not because they've done anything, but because they won the genetic lottery. Good for them. And then if they do get up off their butt and get a job, maybe start a hedge fund with all the money they inherited, they get another tax credit by not touching the special tax deals you have for hedge fund managers. And if they earn a little extra money, they get to keep more of it because there is no alternative minimum tax left. I know that President Trump will particularly appreciate that provision because we all know the only tax return we've seen, the AMT, cost him $31 million. So thank you from the rich. Now, I don't have any problem with people being wealthy. I represent many of them. They don't want this tax cut because they know it's bad for America. And as a final insult, the corporate tax you have encourages businesses to send jobs offshore by not taxing profits made offshore when they expand jobs, if they do. They'll do it offshore, not here in America. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Massachusetts will gain 24,000 jobs. Families will see a $3,000 increase in their paychecks. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to a key member of our committee and a leader in technology and employee stock options, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Paulson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank the chairman. And Mr. Speaker, for the first time in a generation, middle-income and hardworking Americans are closer to a tax code that works for them rather than against them. It's been 31 long years since we last reformed our broken tax system. And in that time, our tax code has become one of the most complicated, unfair, and uncompetitive in the world. It's led to a stagnant economy and sluggish growth. American businesses of all sizes have some of the highest tax rates in the world, sending our jobs, our manufacturing, our research, and our headquarters overseas. And you know, the economic recovery hasn't been all that great since the Great Recession. Not that great for a lot of Americans. Half the population is living paycheck to paycheck. Many either have or are at risk of having a lower standard of living than their parents. Young people, like my daughter's generation, will go backwards if this country is not fundamentally more competitive. And then seniors and those baby boomers preparing for retirement who have a lifetime of savings are now at risk without a growing economy. And the reforms in this bill today will help real people with tax cuts aimed to help middle-income families that want to save for the future and improve their own standard of living. The bill focuses on helping small businesses, Main Street, Minnesota businesses, with a simpler, clear, and fair tax code that is critical for job creation. It lowers small business rates to 25% and even provides a 9% rate for the smallest Main Street startups. Modernizing the tax code is essential to allowing American businesses of all sizes to compete around the world and bring those jobs home. We need to be able to sell where the customers are, and 95% of the world's customers are outside of the United States. The international reforms in this bill will incentivize businesses to bring their money home to invest in our communities. And importantly, this bill includes bipartisan legislation that I authored, the Empowering Employees Through Stock Ownership Act, which helps those entrepreneurs and startups attract and retain talent. Hardworking taxpayers, Mr. Speaker, deserve a tax code that is simpler, flatter, and fairer so that every American family and employer can file their taxes without having to hire an army of lawyers and accountants. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a choice as Americans. We can either truly grow the economy and put ourselves back on the path to real prosperity, or we can continue the actual trend we have right now of weak economic growth which only benefits the few and the privileged and will do nothing for regular folks when the next economic downturn hits. Tax reform for me is about one thing and one thing only. It's about restoring hope for a prosperous future for ourselves, our parents, and most importantly, our children. I want to thank the chairman for his guiding leadership through this effort. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the
Thank you,
gentleman
Mr.
from
Speaker. 40% of Mr. Paulson's constituents claim the SALT deduction, a benefit of over $15,000. They're lucky to break even after this tax bill. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Ron Kind.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are certain phrases that we have learned to grow with, to accept with great suspicion. You know, the check's in the mail. It's not you. It's me. Don't worry. I'll respect you in the morning. I've had just a few drinks. I'm fine with driving. And now we have to add that, don't worry, large tax cuts for the most wealthy will pay for themselves. And I'm a fiscally conservative Republican who cares about debt and deficits. The Joint Committee on Taxation has determined that with interest payments, this bill will add over $2.3 trillion with a T to our national debt over the next 10 years. That's why last week in committee I was offering an amendment that would have expanded the endangered species list to include fiscally conservative Republicans, because your vote on this bill will make you extinct. And what's unfortunate is, unlike past tax cuts that weren't paid for, we've run out of time. We no longer have the luxury of time to recover from a huge fiscal mistake, not with 70 million baby boomers beginning their massive retirement, 10,000 a day, joining Social Security and Medicare. Those programs and the solvency of Social Security and Medicare will be in jeopardy with another $2.3 trillion of debt over the next 10 years. And what's unfortunate, it didn't have to be this way. There was bipartisan interest in simplifying the code, making it more competitive, broadening the base, making it fair for working families and small businesses and family farmers, but doing it in a fiscally responsible way. And asking 34 million Americans to accept a tax increase to pay for a 43% marginal rate reduction to the largest companies is hardly responsible, and it's hardly fair. I encourage my colleagues to let's take a different approach and reject this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the chair of the Budget Committee, who cleared the path for this pro-growth tax reform, the gentlelady of Tennessee, Ms. Black.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my chairman for his endless hours of work, listening to everyday people, listening to small businesses, listening to large businesses, listening to how what we put in this bill was going to affect the American people, who at the end of the day are going to be the winners. So it's been more than 3 decades since Congress has worked with the White House to modernize our nation's very confusing and complicated tax system. Just ask anybody who has filed their taxes on their own. But we're closer to changing that day with H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And with this budget, with the budget passed in both chambers and following last week's productive markup in our House Ways and Means Committee, tax relief is on the horizon. With this legislation, Republicans clearly recognize the need to do something about our heavy tax burden weighing down the hard-working Americans and holding back job creators. We also recognize the need to bring simplicity to the tax code. And in our tax reform plan, we will help low and middle income Americans see more of their hard-earned paychecks by lowering the tax rates and nearly doubling the standard deduction for individuals and married couples. For instance, for an average middle-class family of 4, that translates to a $1,200 tax cut. Now, I'll tell you, that is real money. And we also established a new family credit that raises the child tax credit and introduces new credits for family members and other dependents. The tax code will also become less confusing, making it possible for most Americans to file their taxes on a single postcard. Our plan rightly provides tax relief for job creators, empowering entrepreneurs and small businesses to continue opening and operating and expanding on Main Street. And for my home state of Tennessee, H.R. 1 will allow families to see an estimated $2,200 increase in taxes. Again, that's real money. According to the nonpartisan, Mr. Chairman, may I have another 15 seconds?
Yes, gentlelady's 15 seconds.
Thank you. According to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, this bill would also mean 20,000 new jobs for my state. This will provide a welcome jolt to our economy, which is in badly need following 8 years of lackluster economy under the Obama administration. Without question, enacting tax reform is a challenge, but the benefits of seeing it through will be felt for generations to come. I'm proud to support this legislation. I urge my colleagues to do the same. We cannot miss this historic opportunity. With that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 350,000 Tennessee households making under $132,000 will see a tax increase with this bill. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, a leader on the Higher Education Committee and well known nationally as a spokesperson on education issues.
The gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 1, and I want to thank Mr. Neal for his tireless leadership, pointing out the trail of broken promises that are in this bill for middle-class families who will pay dearly with higher costs for health care, home ownership, and in many, many cases, federal taxes. I would like to zero in for a minute during National Apprenticeship Week on the broken promise the bill represents to growing the U.S. economy, which has a desperate shortage of skilled workers. The obliteration of the student loan interest deduction, which will add $24 billion to the cost of higher education, the taxation of graduate students' tuition waivers, 60% of which are concentrated in STEM curricula, and the elimination of tax-free employer-funded tuition assistance to enhance workplace skills, often using apprenticeship programs, moves this country in exactly the wrong direction to close the skills gap in our workforce, which we all know every member in this body has heard about from employers back home. Indeed, America's CEOs told the president last February at a White House manufacturing summit, jobs exist, skills don't. In fact, the Trump Labor Department reported 6.1 million job openings in the month of September, a near record high. Sadly, this anti-growth tax bill robs American job seekers and employers of the tools to fill those jobs, ironically, during National Apprenticeship Week. Mr. Speaker, I urge the members of this body to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 3 minutes to one of the key members of our tax policy subcommittee and a champion for working men and women, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to take advantage of this historic opportunity that we have before us. As I travel across my district, I hear from families that are struggling to get ahead. I hear from families that can't make ends meet most months. They don't have a whole lot left over. In fact, 63% of American families don't have $500 to handle an emergency. And I hear from businesses that say they'd love to be able to hire, expand, or buy that new piece of equipment, but they just don't have the cash to do it. Our tax code is taking too many dollars from Pennsylvania and sending it to Washington. It's sending good-paying middle-class jobs overseas, and it's holding our economy back, and it's making it harder for so many to get ahead. This is our chance to change the status quo. We have an opportunity to jumpstart our economy and let more hardworking families keep what they earn. We rewrite the tax code for American job creators, taking away the incentives to send jobs overseas and dollars offshore, putting those dollars to work to put more Americans to work as businesses expand and invest here. American tax cuts for American workers with American jobs. We give these small businesses a break, the mom and pop shops that employ Pennsylvanians. We give entrepreneurs who have so much innovation and creativity a wider cushion to take a risk. We're putting more money in the pockets of hardworking families. We're doubling the standard deduction, which means that 94% of taxpayers won't need to itemize at all. Let me say that again. 94% of taxpayers won't even need to itemize at all. By expanding the child tax credit and creating a new $300 credit for parents and non-dependent children, we put an additional $1,800 back in the pockets of every family of four. That's money that they can use as they see fit. And we've streamlined the maze of education tax credits and included in my bipartisan bill apprenticeship programs that can now be made affordable. The taxpayers I hear from say they want to pay less in taxes, not more. If limiting some deductions and lowering your rates means your tax bill is lower at the end of the year, that's a good deal for taxpayers. We owe it to the hardworking, tax-paying families we represent to deliver that. And I urge my colleagues to support the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And all those projects in Philadelphia that are about to come to an end with the abolition of the historic tax credit. With that, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who incidentally is a CPA and a tax attorney.
The gentleman is recognized.
By 2027, roughly a third of middle-class families will be paying more in taxes, and that average family will be paying $1,300 more. The personal exemption, worth $4,150 per person in the family, that's $21,000 for a family of five. They take it away. The moving expense deduction, if you have to move to keep your job, you don't get to deduct that. But if you move a factory to China, you get to deduct all the moving expenses. Student loan debt, they won't let you deduct it. As for the effect on simplicity, my homeboys, my CPA and tax law homeboys are going to be rolling in big dollars, because just from the provisions that define the difference between personal service income, passive income, active business income, the litigation and planning opportunities, talk about complexity, it's all there, and my homeboys love it. We can currently deduct extraordinary medical expenses. That's important to those with disabilities and families with children with special needs. They wipe it out. The extraordinary casualty loss deduction, they wipe out. Very important to people who face floods and fires. They change the rules so we don't have adequate indexing for inflation, so everybody's pushed into a higher tax bracket by inflation, except those at the very top. They're protected. But look at the effect on our nation's economy. This is a job-killing, deficit-exploding, growth-reducing disaster. Look what happened to Kansas. These policies have already devastated one of our states. You're going to be taking $1.5 trillion out of the money available for business investment. The federal government will come in and borrow all that money, leaving less money for factories, farms, and homes. And as Ron Kine pointed out, there's an extra $800 billion of interest on top of that just the next 10 years. And keep in mind, this increase in our debt is forever. Your grandchildren will be paying taxes on this debt. Look at the chart. We had the policies of Ronald Reagan from 1988, when his 1986 law became effective, through 1993. And we had 2.67% growth. In 1994, we got Clinton tax policies. We exploded to over 4% annual growth. Then with George W. Bush, we dropped to 1.7. And then when we adopted Obama tax policies, which are in force today, we're back up to 2.2% economic growth. Which policies give you economic growth? let's look internationally. They say if you move you can manufacture and pay 0% on the profits you earn by a factory, but only if it's a foreign factory. Finally, Mr. Zandi, one of the top economists in the country, testified before our Financial Services Committee that this bill means double-digit declines in the value of homes in American metropolitan areas. What effect does that have on the economy?
Time has expired.
Who's going to go out and spend in the middle class when they're told that the equity in their home has been virtually wiped out? So you can vote against this bill because it's unfair, or you can vote against this bill because it will be a crushing weight on our economy. But don't engage in the fantasy that you can cut taxes and make it up through, quote, economic growth.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, under tax reform, California will grow 111,000 new jobs and paychecks increase by nearly $3,000. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from South Dakota, champion of family-owned farms and businesses, Ms. Noem.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. We have worked hours, literally hundreds of hours, on this legislation, and I commend Chairman Brady and the staff of the Ways and Means Committee for all of their hard work. Mr. Speaker, we've gone through this bill line by line. I've personally fought for policies and ideas in this bill to make sure it works for families, to make sure it increases wages and creates more opportunity for folks all across America. And my goal in this was twofold. Number one, I wanted to strengthen families. Number two, I wanted to create a stronger future for America. This tax reform package puts us well on our way to achieving these goals and achieving some remarkable wins for the American people. I say this because this plan simplifies the tax code. It simplifies it to the point that most people can file their taxes on a form the size of a postcard. It also gives significantly lower rates. It dramatically expands the child tax credit. It keeps the child care credit, and it protects flexible spending benefits. These provisions for working families were important to me. My home state of South Dakota has the highest rate of working families in the nation. The moms and dads in my state aren't working just for fun. They're working to pay the bills, to provide for their families. They need money to put food on the table, to put a roof over their kids' heads. And these provisions are going to help them pay their bills, take care of their kids, go to work, and maybe, just maybe, get a little extra money that they can take their kids off for a weekend and do something fun together. That's important. And when these kids grow up, I want them to be able to find good, high-paying jobs. So I fought hard to make sure that our farmers, our ranchers, and our small businesses could thrive under this new tax code. And we got some pretty big wins for those folks. In this bill, we fully and permanently repealed the death tax, that un-American, unfair double tax. We give people better expensing tools. We drive down the rate for small businesses. If we're going to make sure that our kids can thrive, we need to create opportunities for them to make sure that they can do it right here in America. And this tax reform package lets hardworking job creators do that better. Mr. Speaker, I understand that no tax reform plan is going to be perfect in everybody's eyes. But this proposal is a strong step forward. It reflects real, sustainable policy changes that are going to let people keep more money in their pockets. I've heard from many throughout this debate who have spoken up against these tax cuts and these reforms, people who trust the government with this money more than they trust the American people. Well, Mr. Speaker, I fundamentally disagree. The American people deserve more control over their paychecks. They've worked hard to earn that money. They've taken time away from their families to earn that money. They ought to be the ones deciding how, where, and when to spend it. So for the purposes of strengthening families and offering folks a stronger future here in America, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 38,000 South Dakota households making less than $113,000 a year will see a tax increase under this legislation. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the highly regarded gentleman from Virginia, son of Massachusetts, my friend, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my good friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal. You can put all the lipstick you want on this pig. It's still a pig. Let's be honest. This isn't tax reform. This is a cut on taxes for corporate America, the corporate friends and my friends on the other side of the aisle, and then had to squeeze all kinds of things in to justify it and pay for it. And that's why you, the middle class, are going to suffer. That's why your kids in college are going to start losing their ability to deduct interest on student loans, and they're going to pay taxes on waived tuition when they get a teaching assistant or benefit from the university. That's why your local municipalities are going to lose tax exemption for public activity bonds that fund tens of billions of dollars of public improvements all over the United States. That's why 8.8 million Americans are going to lose the ability to deduct medical costs. And good luck to families who have to put people in nursing homes for long-term care, patients suffering dementia. How will they work that financing out when they lose this deduction? And how will they feel when they know the reason they're losing this deduction is to finance a corporate tax rate? And what about homeowners losing the ability to deduct mortgage interest or to have it capped artificially so corporate America can get the biggest tax cut in history? And oh, by the way, they get to continue to deduct state and local taxes and other kinds of financial interest-related expenses. But not you. Not you, the middle class. It adds $1.5 trillion, and that's with dynamic scoring. Dynamic scoring is another way of saying we kind of fudge the real number. It's more than that, at least $200 billion more than that. And I thought my friends on the other side of the aisle were fiscal hawks dedicated to making sure we didn't have deficits. This is an inconsistent bill. This is going to harm middle-class America. I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill, and let's start over in a bipartisan way. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
But, Mr. Speaker, constituents in Virginia District 11, average household 136,000 with 2 kids will see a tax cut of $5,008. I'm proud to introduce and yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you. I rise today to engage in a colloquy, and I want to first commend Chairman Brady and the Ways and Means Committee for their outstanding work on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which will provide tax relief to millions of hardworking families and businesses. And I'd like to address a small provision in the bill that inadvertently impacts Berea College, a small private college in Berea, Kentucky, that is a member of the federally recognized Work Colleges Consortium. Work colleges, by definition, do not charge their students tuition and also require their students to hold jobs. For over 125 years, Berea College has fulfilled its mission of providing a tuition-free education to students with limited economic resources, primarily from Appalachia, and who are often first-generation college students. Berea pairs its strong academics with student labor program, honoring the dignity and utility of all work. Berea could not fulfill its unique and special mission of providing free tuition to all students without a healthy endowment. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act includes a 1.4% excise tax on private college endowments over $500,000 per student. There are 2 federally recognized work colleges with endowments above this level, including Berea College in my district. I was pleased to learn that the Senate version of the bill exempts schools with fewer than 500 tuition-paying students from the excise tax. This provision would effectively exempt work colleges from the tax because they do not charge tuition. I understand it was never the committee's intent for this legislation to negatively impact work colleges that use their endowments to provide tuition-free education. In fact, I understand the intended purpose of the excise tax is to encourage colleges to use their endowments to keep college costs down. And in this case, Berea College uses its endowment to defray 100% of the cost of tuition. I thank the chairman for his willingness to work with me on a solution in conference, either acceding to the Senate position or another mutually accepted solution that exempts work colleges and allows them to continue their unique mission.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the gentleman from Kentucky for his leadership here. We will work together for a mutually accepted solution to make sure we exempt work colleges that use their endowments to provide tuition-free education.
I thank the chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the well-regarded gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, champion of middle-income people.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank our ranking member for yielding, but also for your tremendous leadership of the Ways and Means Committee in terms of our ranking member and for really telling the truth. I rise in strong opposition to this bill, H.R. 1, which really is a tax scam. Republicans are really trying to pull a fast one on the American people. This bill would steal from the hard-earned paychecks of millions of middle-income families to line the pockets of billionaires and corporations. In fact, 80% of the tax breaks will go to the top 1%. It also eliminates student loan deductions and eradicates medical expense deductions. And now, if this isn't cruel enough, this bill makes it easier for corporations to ship jobs overseas, so people will actually lose their jobs. This tax plan does nothing to create better jobs or better wages or a better future for the middle class. It does just the opposite. Now, in my home state of California, 1 in 5 middle-income families will see a tax hike next year. And the state and local tax deduction would be particularly hard on my state, where 6.1 million households will see a tax increase. Public sector jobs like firefighters will lose their jobs, not to mention the vital services our most vulnerable will need. These will be cut. This bill really is a disgrace. Stealing from families who need help the most to give to more donors, millionaires and billionaires and corporations, this is really a new low. 36 million middle-income households, working families will pay more in taxes. So we can't forget also that this tax scam sets the stage really for a heartless $1.5 trillion cut to Medicare and Medicaid, as we saw in the Republican budget. So we need to reject this mean-spirited tax scam and vote no, and come back and look at how we can support middle-income families, working families, so everyone has a chance and an opportunity at the American dream. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I would note that constituents in the Californian 3rd, 13th District have median family of $407,000 will see a tax cut of $2,589, and I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
from West Virginia is
For
recognized.
this opportunity to discuss the historic preservation tax credits that historically have stimulated nearly $150 billion in private sector investment. As we've discussed over the last month, the tax credit is critically important for economic development and revitalization, especially in small rural areas of this country. Without the credit, projects that transform communities in all 50 states from West Virginia to Texas to Wisconsin simply will not happen. Mr. Chairman, your word means something to me. So I'm asking for your commitment to continue working with me to ensure that the federal historic tax credit is preserved in the final tax reform package. And I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley. You are passionate about making sure our smaller communities can revitalize and grow, and about the role of the historic preservation tax credit in doing that. I commit to working with you and continuing to work with you on this issue because I know the importance of it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you as well. We've had a good working relationship over the years, and I want to continue this process because I understand this process.
Yes, sir.
And I will be voting to continue the process in anticipation that it will be in the final bill.
Let's work together. Yes, sir.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the very capable gentlelady from Massachusetts, a valued member of our delegation, Congresswoman Catherine Clark.
The gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized. Pardon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank our ranking member for yielding and for all your incredible work on this bill. We were promised tax reform, but that's not what we're seeing in this bill. In fact, you don't have to dig far into this 429-page bill to see that it's a con, a cynical bait and switch for families at home. And when this bill was released just 2 weeks ago, I started getting calls from families at home wanting to know how it would affect them. So we dug into it, and I want to share just a few of those examples, but it didn't take long to see why it was developed in secret and why it's being rushed to a vote. On page 254, Republicans propose getting rid of a program that helps veterans find work when they come home. 300,000 veterans have been helped by the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. The repeal of this provision to reduce taxes for the very wealthiest is a cold-hearted way to say thank you for your service. On page 113, this tax scam sends a bill to 9 million households who have extremely high medical costs. Tax breaks for billionaires are expensive. We get that. And under this plan, Americans who live in nursing homes, have a sick child, high medical costs, will foot the bill. On pages 95 and 97, students get added to the list of Americans who will be forced to pay for the GOP's tax breaks for corporations. They will see increased debt and taxes. This bill says, good luck, students, building an economy that will not only allow you to pay off the $1.3 trillion of existing student debt, but will add $2.3 trillion in deficit. This bill created for you. Just yesterday, the president's chief economic strategist was surprised when the CEOs gathered admitted they would not be investing their tax cuts in jobs and wages. He shouldn't have been.
Gentlelady has another 30 seconds.
He should not have been surprised. Corporations are already sitting on record amounts of cash, while generations of hardworking Americans have had to pay for tax experiments like this, based on disproven economic theories. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. Let's reject this bill and work together to create a bipartisan tax reform that is fair and benefits all families.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in the 5th District of Massachusetts, for that median household of 4 of 143,000 will see a tax cut of $5,208. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to one of our key leaders on tax reform on the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from New York, my friend, Mr. Reed.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the chairman for all his hard work in putting this bill together. Mr. Speaker, this bill has been in the process for over 7 years in regards to the time I spent on the committee. There have been multiple hearings on the issue of tax reform, well over 40 plus. There have been hours upon hours of debate. There was efforts done by our former chairman, Dave Camp, and I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have recognized during our committee markup process the hard work that Chairman Camp did with rewriting the entire code from the bottom up. These issues have been out there for the American people and for the people from across the country to look at, to digest, and now is the time to rise in support of this legislation, Mr. Speaker, because what we have before you is a new tax code for the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, we have a tax code that's going to, for once in 31 years, put our corporations on the multinational level across the world in a competitive position by lowering the rates and getting to a 21st taxing program on a territorial basis. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, we deliver tax relief, and I know the folks on the other side aren't going to agree with this because they're going to say this is a tax for the rich, this is a tax code, tax reform for the rich and the almighty 1%. But, Mr. Speaker, I've done the math. I've looked at this bill inside and out, and it delivers a simplified code where $1,600 is left in the pockets of my constituents in Western New York. That's $1,600 that they earned that the government won't have to take from them anymore. $1,600, Mr. Speaker, that will allow them as senior citizens to go visit their grandkids in the South because New York State has driven them out of New York State with its high tax policies at the state capitol. That's $1,600 that maybe they can go on a trip with their family and experience a little relaxation because of the hard work that generated those monies and those dollars in their pockets. Mr. Speaker, these are the people that we represent, the Perrys. Mr. and Mrs. Perry are hardworking people of Western New York, and those are their two beautiful children. And what this is going to allow them to do is get a little bit more of their money kept in their pocket so they can spend a little bit more time with their kids and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman, I know my colleagues on the other side advocate, because there's another issue with tax reform that I want to highlight real quick. The easy approach of government is to spend more money and develop more programs and maybe give a little bit in regards to a government welfare check. But what this tax code does and reform does is deliver a job opportunity for these people. And I don't know a better program in America that serves more people than an honest day's work and an honest paycheck and an honest job. And that's what this tax code will do. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, correction. Not one hearing was held on this tax bill. 38,000 people in Mr. Reed's district will lose the student loan interest deduction. And with that, I'd like to introduce a real champion of the working class in America, the gentlelady from Ohio, Marcy Kaptur, for 1 minute.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank the exceptional leadership of Ranking Member Richard Neal of Massachusetts in trying to fix this horrendous bill. Mr. Speaker, the GOP-led tax and deficit disaster rewards the big corporations and billionaires. It will accelerate job outsourcing. Indeed, 50% of the tax benefits go to the top 1%. This tax scam locks in, get this, a $621,500 tax bonus to each billionaire in the billionaire class. The top 1/10 of 1%. Do you really think they need it? Meanwhile, this tax scam raids money from the pockets of 38 million middle-class taxpayers, likely those caring for their sick relatives or trying to help their kids in college. Do you really think the 1/10 of 1% need more? Money trading Wall Street megabanks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, already making billions, will get more tax bonuses courtesy of the middle class. This job outsourcing tax bill of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich, well, if it walks like a duck,
gentlelady's time has
quacks
expired.
like a duck.
Additional 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentleman is recognized.
If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck, and this duck belongs in the swamp, which voters may have thought they were draining in the last election. Well, folks, this bill makes the swamp wider and deeper, and the fat ducks will be even fatter and happier in it. I urge my colleagues to vote for the middle class, not the billionaire donor class. Vote no. Drain the swamp. I yield back. Thank you, gentlemen.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for that family of 4 in Ohio in the 9th District, 64,000 household, will see a tax cut of $1,284. This time I'm yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for working diligently to create the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that will give a tax break to the middle class. After speaking to both Speaker Paul Ryan and Ways and Means Committee, little promotion there, Tom Reed, I believe that an unintended consequence of this bill would hinder middle-class Americans pursuing a higher education degree in an attempt to better their lives. These consequences will affect the education of employees of universities, graduate students, and employees receiving employer-provided education benefits. Mr. Chairman, under current law, higher education institutions can provide tax-free tuition waivers or reimbursement to employees, spouses, and dependents. Secondly, many universities provide graduate students, including PhD candidates, with tuition relief and stipends, which they can utilize while pursuing their degrees. Several of my constituents, including my niece, Sarah Schiavone, who is a PhD student, would be impacted by this. Thirdly, employer-provided education incentives are currently not taxed. I offered two amendments, Amendment 20 and 21 to H.R. 1, that would have kept these qualified tuition reduction benefits, and it currently would have provided them to continue. We hope.
I inadvertently cut the gentleman short. I yield an additional 2 minutes to he and Mr. Davis.
Nice for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the Senate is working on their version of the tax reform package, and as of today, the Senate bill does not include the repeal of these vital education benefits. Mr. Chairman, I would like your assurances that the current status of these education benefits will be protected during conference debate. I'm requesting you continue to work with my office as we together address this issue, and also it's my honor to yield to Mr. Davis.
Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Turner. It's a privilege to be able to work with you on this issue. And, Mr. Chairman, it's a privilege to work with you. With 8 colleges and universities in my district, I cannot ignore the impact that eliminating this section that Mr. Turner eloquently explained, the impact it may have on the students and the employees in my district at all of those institutions. The University of Illinois, the largest university in my district, provided $184 million in tuition waivers to 1,387 faculty and staff last year alone. 1,100 of those employees made less than $75,000. I'm worried, too, that this is going to have a tremendous impact on graduate students. I'm worried it's going to have an impact on the custodians and the assistants in the registrar's office who are just working at these institutions to be able to send their son or daughter to college. So I look forward to working with you, Mr. Turner, Mr. Chairman, in working toward a solution.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I would like to thank Mr. Turner and Mr. Davis for raising this important issue. On the committee, Representatives Meehan and Lynn Jenkins really led the discussion and share your sentiments. We have a keen interest in this issue. We will work with you toward a positive solution on tuition assistance in conference with the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With that, I'd like to introduce a gentleman from Vermont who was a son of Springfield, Massachusetts. Very distinguished gentleman, Congressman Peter Welsh.
For how much time is the gentleman recognized?
I thank the gentleman.
2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for the authors of this bill. What do you have against students? You're imposing an opportunity tax. A young Vermonter who wants to get a certificate in welding or get a degree from our community college and gets tuition assistance from an employer, they have to pay taxes on that. If they borrow money from the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, they have to pay more because they can't deduct that interest. And, by the way, the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation has to charge higher interest because we're eliminating private activity bonds and they don't get the benefit of the municipal bonds rate. And I have another question. What do you got against teachers? They reach in their pocket at the beginning of school to help out with school supplies. They lose the deduction. And I have another question. What do you have against people who have a loved one with Alzheimer's? They can't deduct the cost of that medical care. And by the way, that was the retirement they were hoping to send on.
Members are reminded to address their comments to the chair.
Well, I have another question.
The gentleman is recognized.
And ask it of the leadership. What happened to democracy? We were promised an open process, and there was a model for this. It was President Reagan and Dan Rostenkowski. 4 months of actual hearings, witnesses testifying about the bill. This was written in secret. And oh, by the way, no amendments. Now, we could ask 435 members of Congress whether we should stick it to the students like we're doing in this bill. And 435 of us would all stand up for the students. But you know what? Not a single one of us is given the opportunity to ask the question, do we want to stick it to our students who want to get a welding degree or a college degree? That's disgraceful. And it's inexcusable, and it's within the control of the majority, and they're denying us the opportunity. Here's the big deal that we know. This bill was written by and for the donor class that have flooded and contaminated this political process with billions of dollars in our campaigns. And I say, Mr. Speaker, defeat this bill.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the Tax Cuts and Job Acts for families of four in Vermont making $89,000 will see a tax cut of $2,030. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to one of our key leaders, champion for small business, the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Walorski. And I also ask unanimous consent. The gentleman from Illinois be permitted to control the remainder of the time on our side.
Without objection, the gentlelady from Illinois is recognized. Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of your work. Madam Speaker, I can't tell you how grateful I am to cast a vote to move our tax code one step closer to its first overhaul in 31 years. We know the tax code's broken. The American people know the tax code's broken. They're reminded every time they look at their paycheck. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will deliver pro-growth tax reform to the families, farmers, manufacturers, and workers in my district. For families, we're delivering tax cuts so that hardworking Hoosiers can keep more of their hard-earned money. We're enhancing the child tax credit, preserving the adoption tax credit, encouraging retirement savings, and streamlining 15 different education tax incentives. We're delivering a tax code so simple, most Americans can file taxes on a postcard. In my district, 80% of filers already take the standard deduction. They'll be able to keep even more of their money because the standard deduction is doubled, and most itemizers will now be able to save time, money, and stress by taking the double standard deduction instead. No one's ever excited to file their taxes, but I'm all for a simpler, quicker process that makes it much more pain-free. H.R. 1 helps job creators grow. Small businesses get a lower rate and more simplicity. Family businesses passed down for generations won't have to worry about the estate tax anymore, and America will be a more attractive place to do business. Our antiquated tax code keeps investment in jobs out. This bill incentivizes companies to bring profits back, to locate facilities here, and grow American jobs and raise wages. Madam Speaker, I was so proud to vote for this bill in the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm proud to be a part of this House that is delivering yet another crucial step towards tax cuts, simplicity, and fairness. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts
Thank you,
is recognized.
Madam Speaker. The University of Notre Dame is about to get slugged with a new tax, and the clock is running out. And with that, I'd like to introduce the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who has been a champion of the working class.
Thank you so much.
For how much time?
2 minutes.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Neal. I appreciate this time. Ladies and gentlemen of this House, and ladies and gentlemen who are watching across this nation, my heart is heavy tonight, and it's heavy because we are faced with the absolute most dangerous, destructive, and deceitful tax reform bill in the history of this Congress. Now, let me tell you why. On the other side, you've heard member after member on the other side get up and tell you, this is going to get a tax cut. We're going to give the wealthy a tax cut. We're going to give the corporations a tax cut. But none of them have told you or the American people how they're going to pay for it. And the great tragedy is, the most deceitful thing about what my colleagues on the other side are doing to the American people is they are doing these tax cuts for the wealthy, the tax cuts for the corporations, on the backs of the poor, the middle class. Let me tell you why. They won't tell you that they're paying for this tax cut because and on $1.5 trillion that they will cut from Medicaid, from Medicare. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of this country, Medicaid is for the children. There are literally millions of children on there. You heard one of my colleagues go down. We're losing 20 veterans to suicide every single day. No mention of that, but yet they will cut the veterans program designed to help them. to pay for this tax cut. And not to mention the student loan interest rate. Young people across this country, you need to rise up. Seniors, we need to rise up. We need to rise up and stand and fight for this country. Let our minds go back to 1770 in Boston at the harbor when they threw the tea over that founded the foundation of our great democracy.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I ask the American people to stand up and help us Democrats defeat
regular order.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Bill.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The good news is that the good people of Georgia's 13th District, median household income, family of 4 at $80,000 would receive a $1,700 tax break. And with that, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, former treasurer of one of the largest counties in our country.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Look, this is one of those moments where, and forgive me, but I sometimes feel like I live and work in a math-free zone, because you can't intellectually have it both ways, where you're talking about the great difficulties coming, and then when you bring in the actual data and you actually start to look at the charts that we all see, it isn't in the future. It's right on the cusp of us, and that is the debt and entitlement crisis. If we do not start to get some economic growth, we are in so much trouble. So if you really care about Medicare, Medicaid, the children, this education program, this health research, where's the money coming from? It's on the cusp. This is less than a decade away. In just a few years, we cross 100% of GDP. And that's publicly held. And then the ability to sell the bonds if we do not get economic growth. But if you look at the last 30 years and the charts and the data, and I'm sorry, I know this is small and I know it's math, so it's uncomfortable for a lot of people in this body. If you actually look across here and you see this is entitlements to GDP, when we've been in times of economic expansion, all of a sudden our ability to finance, to maintain the promises we've made as a society, the math works. And this is a commonality. We both understand economic growth is our only path, because if it's not, are you, on your side, ready to do fairly draconian cuts? So if we actually look at some of the data that's come from the Tax Foundation's modeling says $1 trillion of additional taxes, but almost $300 billion in additional payroll taxes over the 10 years. I've already heard a couple of people get behind the microphone here and use the term that the $1.5 trillion is dynamic scored. No, that's a static score. And all dynamic scoring is, so we all have a commonality, is you calculate back in the size of the economy. You loop back in the size of the economy. And you can't have it both ways. You either support dynamic scoring or you oppose it for global warming. You oppose it for immigration. You oppose it for the stimulus. Because we actually, as a body, every March when CBO brings us the numbers, they give us a number that's been dynamically scored. I know we all want what's best for this nation. But as I dig through the math, if we get the economic growth that I believe this tax model, so many of the very difficult decisions we as a body have to make over the next decade get much easier. Let's hope we get there. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman's sincerity as we proceed to watch them borrow $2.3 trillion on the deficit. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, from a well-known family, Congressman Dan Kildee.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for yielding and for his incredible leadership on this subject. And look, you can't have it both ways. I just heard it said. You can't have it both ways. And so what I suspect will happen after I get done, as has been the case with every one of the speakers on this side, The gentleman on the other side will say that residents in my hometown will get a tax break of X, $1,000. I would ask the gentleman if he would add to that the amount of the debt that is being borne by each one of these families, because the way I've got it calculated, it costs a family of four about $20,000 for your debt that you are willing to levy against our children and grandchildren in order to give the richest 1% of the Americans a massive tax break. You can't deny the math that almost all the benefit goes to the people at the top. The top 1% are huge beneficiaries. You can't deny the math that 5,400 families will get a massive tax break. And you can't deny the math that says that every single American will take on additional debt, a family of four, $20,000 in debt. I also was intrigued by the colloquy where members came to ask the leadership if they will work with them to take out egregious elements of this tax proposal. And we get this sort of, yes, I'll work with the gentleman answer. I have a question. Why did you put it in the first place? Why are you cutting brownfield tax credits? Why are you cutting new market tax credits? Why are you cutting historic tax credits in the first place? You just wrote the bill. You just wrote it. Why did you put it in the first place? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. We can't pass debt to our children in order to finance
Time has
tax
expired.
breaks for the people at the very top. I yield
And is
back.
no longer recognized. The chair would like to remind all members that they should address their remarks to the chair and not to others in the chamber. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The good news is it's not just $1,000 for the gentleman's district, it's $1,200. And claiming my time, I will yield myself 30 seconds. Let's go right to this student issue. It was the Obama administration that proposed in the 2017 budget for the elimination of the student deduction. So I think the sanctimonious needs to just to walk out of the chamber. The $2,500 above-the-line deduction is a $375 tax break. We're proposing something far greater than that, with doubling the standard deduction, lowering the rates, and so forth. So let's just take the Madam Speaker, the student
gentleman's
deduction
time
and
has
chuck it in the
expired.
garbage. I yield a minute to the gentlelady from Missouri.
Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, it's about time we get something real done for the American people. The people of Missouri's 2nd District sent me to Washington to secure their jobs and to keep a little more of their hard-earned money. And at long last, we are finally doing just that. I vote yes to fix our broken tax system. I vote yes to help reignite the American economy. I vote yes to make it a little bit easier for that single mother of two, that firefighter, that teacher, shop owner, family of four, that veteran. I vote yes for bigger paychecks, better savings, and a more secure future. I ran for Congress to fight for the people of Missouri and to ensure that every hard-working American can realize their own American dream. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And with that, I'd like to use the next 2 minutes and yield them to the gentleman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, conscience of the House and champion of all things Pittsburgh, Mr. Doyle.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this terrible bill. Many of my colleagues have called it a scam, and they're absolutely right. Supporters of this bill have said everyone gets a tax cut. That's not true. Millions of Americans get a tax increase, more and more each year, in fact. Supporters of this bill have called it a middle-class tax cut. That's not true. The lion's share of the money goes to corporations and households making $1 million or more, not to families struggling paycheck from paycheck. And what this bill gives to the middle class in one hand, it takes it away with the other, with devastating consequences for households with high medical costs, student loans, or high state and local taxes. Supporters of this bill have claimed that it will keep companies from moving jobs overseas, create new jobs here at home, raise wages for American worker. That's not true. While this bill cuts corporate tax rates, it creates new incentives for shipping our jobs abroad. And finally, does anyone really believe that tax cuts for corporations of the rich will trickle down to the rest of us? It didn't work in the Reagan administration. It didn't work in the Bush administration. It didn't work in Kansas, and it's not going to work today. Make no mistake, colleagues, this massive tax cut for corporations and the rich will increase deficits and the national debt by trillions of dollars, sticking the rest of us, especially our kids, with the bill. Madam Speaker, this massive tax cut for corporations and the wealthy, it's not a middle-class tax cut. It won't create jobs or raise wages. It isn't simple, it isn't reform, and it certainly won't pay for itself. If we want to increase economic growth, let's give a real break to the middle class and to small businesses. They'll put that money right back into the economy. That's the way to create jobs and boost wages. The gentleman's time has expired. I urge my colleagues to reject this giveaway to the rich. The gentleman's time has expired. With a bipartisan bill that
gentleman
truly
is
benefits
no longer
the middle class.
recognized. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Speaker, my friends on the other side of the aisle need to make a decision. Do they want to lionize Ronald Reagan or criticize Ronald Reagan? I'll leave it to them to decide which. And as they're thinking, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to adamantly dispute this false narrative that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is only intended to benefit the wealthiest Americans and does not benefit the middle class. When you hear this fiction from the other side of the aisle, remember these facts. This bill lowers tax rates on low and middle income Americans. It takes the lowest 10% bracket to zero, and it doubles the standard deduction, meaning hardworking Americans can immediately take home more of their paychecks. Specifically, the first $24,000 of family income will be completely tax-free under this plan. By slashing our non-competitive corporate tax rate, this bill will result in more jobs, and according to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, it will deliver average American households a pay raise of at least 2.5%. And with this legislation, a typical family of four earning $59,000, the median household income will receive a $1,182 tax cut. Madam Speaker, that is not a tax cut for the rich. That is a tax cut for low and middle income hardworking Americans, and that is a fact. This will benefit people like Jared from Frankfort, Kentucky, who told me the extra income from the tax cut will enable us to have some breathing room. It will also help constituents who are living paycheck to paycheck, who've told me they would use these tax cuts to save for a rainy day, make car repairs, occasionally go to a restaurant, and invest in higher education for their kids. And I heard from my constituent in Lexington named Gary, who told me, quote, "It doesn't matter how I plan to use my money. By definition, it's my money to begin with. Trust me to spend it in the way that applies for me." And Gary, you're absolutely right. It's your money. Tax relief is not about handouts. It's simply about allowing the American people to keep more of the hard-earned income that they made on behalf of all of the hard-earned hard-working people of Central Kentucky. I urge my colleagues to vote for Gary. And vote for all
the gentleman's time has expired.
To keep more of what they earned. Vote yes.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, well known and well regarded as he addresses national economic issues, Congressman Ryan.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for his leadership on this. The last time there was tax reform, it was 31 years ago. Since then, 96% of income growth went to the top 10% of the people in the country. 96% went to the top 10%. The top 1% control 90% of the wealth in this country. 63% of average families in the United States of America could not withstand a $500 emergency. We have pensions collapsing. We have communities that have eroded, wiped out. And the Republican plan to fix all of this is to go to the Chinese government, borrow $2.3 trillion, and bring it back to the United States and give it to the wealthiest people in this country. Now, that is not going to fix a damn thing in the United States. It's not going to help Flint. It's not going to help Springfield. It's not going to help Youngstown or Pittsburgh or Gary. I'm talking about Gary, Indiana. We'll get hammered from this thing. And we have tried this before, and many of you were here. President Bush did this. He said, we're going to cut taxes for the wealthy. It's going to lead to growth. Wages are going to go up. We had the most stagnant decade of growth since the Great Depression, and it ended in a complete economic collapse. This is a canard. This economic philosophy stinks. It doesn't work, and it hammers working class people. And to put a little salt in the wound, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, to put a little salt in the wound, you keep the deduction that allows a corporation to outsource jobs from our communities to other countries. The only place this bill is going to create a job, the only place this bill is going to create a job is in Beijing, China. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Well, Madam Speaker, as you know, the good news is, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 70% of the individual tax relief goes to families earning under $200,000, according to their publication on November 13th. With that, I yield a minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Madam Speaker, I think no one in this chamber can dispute when I say that America's tax code is broken. I rise today to stand with my colleagues in support of pro-growth tax reform because our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act works for the middle class. For too long, a complex tax code, high rates, and burdensome regulations have held back opportunities for hardworking families. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act offers much-needed tax relief for low-income and middle-income Americans. It focuses on middle-class tax cuts that allow hard-working Floridians to keep more of their paychecks so that they can save for their children's college fund, so that they can invest in their retirement, so they can enjoy vacations with their family. Florida families know how to spend their money better than the government, and this plan allows them to keep more of their money that they earn, instead of waiting for tax returns and deductions to give them their money back. This bill is pro-family, it's pro-business, and it will give our economy a boost. And nothing will address our debt.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And growth. I yield back, urge my colleagues to support this bill.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves, gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, well known as a champion of America's middle class, Mr. McInerney.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the ranking member of the subcommittee, the committee, for his hard work on this. He's been a great voice. You know, this is a harmful and it's a deceitful bill. It's strictly partisan. We've learned over the years, if you do something strictly on a partisan basis, it isn't going to work. It's going to fall apart. It'll come back to you. I'm telling you, learn from our mistakes. Work with us. There hasn't been a single hearing on this bill. Is the public out there confused? They should be, because they haven't been informed about what this bill does. It was rushed through in 1 week. It takes more than a week to name a post office around here. What's the deal? What's going on here? No one really understands the consequences of this bill. But I can tell you what it does. It'll greatly reduce taxes for corporate America. It'll reduce taxes for the wealthy. And so where do you think the money is going to come from to pay for Social Security, to pay for our roads and highways, to pay for our education, to pay for Medicare? I can tell you, if you haven't guessed, it's going to come from the middle class. There's no other way that we can pay for this. So I'll be kind and say maybe they're being over optimistic. Maybe they don't really understand what's going on here. But don't believe it. You're going to pay more taxes. It's going to come out of your hide. And when I sit down, the member from Nebraska is going to say, in my district, you're going to get $1,200 more or $1,700 more. No, you're going to pay more. You're not going to get more money back. In California, 6 million people will lose the tax deductions, the state income tax deduction. What does that mean? That means you're going to pay taxes twice on your earned income. In California, homeowners are going to get hit hard. I don't see how anyone from California can vote for this bill. Education will be more expensive. Student loans will not be deductible. This bill will hurt our nation's ability to compete. And what does that mean? It means lower pay. It means layoffs.
The gentleman's time has expired.
This tax overhaul is a big lie. Not 1 week. We should oppose this bill and start over and do it right.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the good news is it's not $1,200, it's not $1,700, it's $1,900 for the median household in California's 9th District. I'd like to now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, great friend of agriculture and a great friend of small business.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. A lot has been said today on the floor about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from my friends on the other side of the aisle. They think that this bill before us will make losers of the American workers or of the American economy. The truth is the status quo. Our current broken tax code is causing our workers and our economy to lose. Back in Southeast Missouri, I'll give you an example under the current tax code. A machinist in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, working 40 hours a week is fearful to work harder because the more money that they make, the less that they will have percentage-wise under our current tax code. That's simply not right, Madam Speaker. Back in Southeast Missouri, a cotton farmer in Hayti has worked for decades to build his family farm, hoping to pass it on to his daughter. Yet under the current system, his daughter would have to sell portions of the farm or take out a massive loan to continue the family operation. The status quo in our tax code that is rigged against the American taxpayer, they can't afford an army of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists to find all the loopholes and the bailouts available only to a select few. The status quo are tax rates for businesses that are so high that the American companies are not able to grow, hire new workers, or be competitive with other countries around the world. The other side of the aisle is arguing to keep a broken tax code that is pushing hardworking taxpayers, that is punishing hardworking taxpayers. All of the grandstanding leaves us with one question that needs to be answered for the American people. What do these tax cuts mean for you? It means that the hardworking family in Southeast Missouri will keep more of their paycheck. Instead of being penalized for success, this bill is about employees. It's about wages. It's about getting to keep more of what you earn. For families and couples, the first $24,000 you earn under this bill will be tax-free. You get to keep it. You get to decide how to spend your own money, not the government. It means that the small businesses and family farms won't feel the sting of the IRS and the death tax when tragedy strikes on their family. It means that lobbyists and special interests become the losers. We close loopholes and handouts that the hardworking taxpayer can't get. We are ending a tax code that isn't built for the everyday American. We are making it simple and fair. It means that America can now compete and win again. With this bill, we lower the business rate to historic levels. We are making our economy healthy again. And we know from history that a healthy economy takes care of itself. It is more stable and sustainable. It provides for full employment better jobs, and higher wages. Former President John F. Kennedy knew this when he said, "Our true choice is not between tax reduction on the one hand and the avoidance of large federal deficits on the other. It is increasingly clear that no matter what party is in power, so long as our national security needs keep rising, an economy hampered by restrictive tax rates will never produce enough revenue to balance our budget, just as it will never produce enough jobs or enough profits."
The gentleman's time has expired.
Yield an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman's recognized.
Surely the lesson of the last decades in the budget deficits are not caused by wild-eyed spenders, but by slow economic growth and periodic recessions. And any new recession would break all deficit records. This bill makes the American worker, the American family, the American farmer, the American small businesses, and the American economy winners once again. I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you,
is
Madam Speaker. 28,000 people will use the student loan interest deduction in Missouri number 8, claiming nearly $33 million in deduction. And with that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, medical man, Dr. Ruiz, and Congressman, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal, for the opportunity to speak on this bill. The fact is, I do want to simplify our tax code, and I do want tax reform. A tax reform that relieves the burden on our middle class, our seniors, our veterans, and our students. But let's just see how this bill fares with the middle class, seniors, veterans, and students. So my middle class constituents in California will be double taxed on their income, but big corporations will get tax relief. Veterans in my district will find it harder to find work or a home because this bill eliminates tax credits for hiring veterans and harms efforts to end veterans' homelessness. Middle-class homeowners across California will see the value of their homes decrease by as much as 10%. Students will get hit with the largest relative tax increase in this bill. And seniors will see a Medicare cut by $25 billion a year. That's over $100 billion of Medicare cuts over the next 4 years. 38 million middle-class families will see their taxes increase. They always point to this family of 4 earning $59,000 getting a certain amount of tax cuts, but 38 million middle-class families will see their taxes increase. All this while giving tax breaks to millionaires, billionaires, and corporations who ship jobs overseas and raise the deficit by $1.44 trillion within 10 years. In fact, nearly 85% of the tax cuts in this bill go to millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations that ship jobs overseas. The bottom line is this bill raises taxes on the middle class and gives tax breaks to billionaires. This is irresponsible and unacceptable. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and protect Medicare, protect the middle class,
from Illinois
protect
is
seniors,
recognized.
protect veterans,
The gentleman is
and
no
protect
longer
students.
recognized. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I don't know, Madam Speaker, if you're in California's 36th district and your median household income is $58,000, it looks like a tax cut of $1,090. Now, I'm informed that our friends on the other side have more time, and my suggestion is that we will reserve our time and let our friends use some of their time and get back in balance.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm nervous to yield with that sort of look.
Do you want to yield the rest of your time to me?
I'm not using my time. I'm not yielding my time. You've got plenty of it. You want to claim your time and yield to me?
You've already run out of speakers, you said.
You've got more time left than, Madam, the gentleman has more time than we do.
Might I inquire how much time
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. Massachusetts is recognized.
How much time do we have left, you said, Madam Speaker?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 16 1/4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We just happen to have the nephew of former President Kennedy here, who's going to set the record straight on that quote that was attributed to President Kennedy but a few moments ago. With that, I yield 2 minutes to a very good member of the Massachusetts congressional delegation and my friend, Joe Kennedy.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I thank you, and I thank my friend and a mentor in the House, Dean of our delegation in Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his leadership on this issue and so many others. I'm always heartened by the quotes of President Kennedy offered by any member of this body. I'd like to think that they would seek to emulate him not just on the marginal tax cuts that were put forth some 50 years ago, but also on his stance on immigration, on civil rights, and on his stance with Russia. But those are issues for another day, Madam Speaker. The issue today is a vote that we will take on this floor tomorrow to rewrite an American tax code that will touch every single American life. True tax reform is complicated, it's cumbersome, and above all else, it is deeply personal. But this bill is none of those things. It is a massive, permanent handout to corporations, passed off on American families. It is a terrifyingly precise attack on patients with chronic illness, a heartless roadblock for low-income students, and a choice to value inherited wealth more than hard-earned income. It is a gift to corporations and the richest among us, and it is paid for by long nights, by double shifts, by vacations not taken, and of hard-working American families sacrificing for their hope for a better tomorrow. You are asking them to fortify your tax cuts with, and stock options with their classrooms, with your corporate profits with their roads and bridges, your balance sheets with their hard-earned retirement and health care benefits. And for all the talk about the boost to corporate profits, 80% of the stocks in this country are owned by 10% of Americans. Ask yourself who's going to actually be the beneficiary of all that money. That's what this bill does. You've heard from my Republican friends over the course of the past couple of days about what this will save the average American family, but not about the 36 million people and families that will experience the tax hike. What they aren't telling you is what's going to happen the moment that this bill is passed. Luckily for the American public, one of the chief economic advisors to the president has said so. And he said that after this bill is done, they're turning directly towards welfare cuts, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So when you hear questions about how much this bill is going to save you, ask you how much your retirement security is going to be cut, when you go right to Social Security. Ask them how much more money that $1,000 is going to save you when your health care benefits are taken. And by the way, that clause just got added over in the Senate. Ask them how much more some savings might go for one family when you gut and shred a social safety net that has powered the greatest expansion of economic growth that this country has ever seen. That's what your bill does. That's what this bill means. That's what this bill is about the values and vision of an America, about a tax structure that should reflect the values of the American family, not the values of corporate balance sheets. I yield back.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, well-known champion of civil liberties and a scholar of the law, Congressman Raskin, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, thank you. And Mr. Neal, thank you. As my friends across the aisle prepare their statistics about my congressional district, where 500 people rallied against the tax plan this last weekend, I want to invite you to come to my district and to debate me and several other members of our caucus, and I'm happy to come to your district and debate it too, because the American people should be able to be part of this decision. When the majority voted to throw 30 million Americans off of their health insurance plans, they went over to the White House where they celebrated like it was Mardi Gras, the Super Bowl, and Herbert Hoover's birthday all put together. And when millions of middle-class Americans rebelled and defeated that monstrosity of a bill, Donald Trump pointed at them and said they had all voted for a mean bill. And he was right. And now, like lamb to the slaughter, they're about to vote for another mean bill. A tax scam written by corporate lobbyists in the dark of night, now moving through Congress with the speed of light. And while our poor colleagues grimly walk the plank for the billionaires and Wall Street tycoons in the Trump cabinet who are getting ready to laugh all the way to the bank, when middle-class Americans rebel again this week and next week and the week after that, and this tax scam bites the dust, President Trump can turn around again and call this monstrosity not only mean, but greedy. This mean and greedy tax scam puts $1.5 trillion on America's credit card so the sons and daughters of the middle class can pay the rest of their lives for a gigantic corporate tax cut in a period of record corporate profits. 1/3 of the windfall raining down on corporate investors will go abroad, because more than 1/3 of corporate wealth is owned by foreign investors. That's more than $500 billion that goes not even to our own rich people, but to Saudi Arabia and China and other foreign investor havens, and it will not go to Medicare or Medicaid or other public purposes at home. Then they move to the so-called territorial tax system so that corporate profits moved abroad will escape our normal system, giving incentive to record job flight. Somebody tell Donald Trump about this, because this tax scam puts foreign jobs first. Meantime, 34 million middle-class Americans get hit with a tax increase. Goodbye to the health care deduction. Goodbye to the college loan interest deduction. Farewell to a meaningful state and local tax deduction. Oh, and farewell to the estate tax, which applies only to billionaires and the richest millionaires in the country, 2 of 1,000 families. Where's the democracy? Where's the legislative process? When we had a bipartisan bill in 1986, we took more than 2 years. It passed with overwhelming support. Now this tax scam has had no hearings, no experts, no citizen testimony. What a scandal it is. We do need tax reform, but we don't need a corporate tax scam imposed against the middle class. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois continues to reserve. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady and ranking member of the Financial Services Committee from California, Congresswoman Waters.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1, which is just a continuation of Republicans' relentless attack on working families. This is not a tax plan. It is a tax scam. This president won't disclose how he is going to benefit from this tax scam. He has disrespected us all. This tax scam will eliminate the student loan interest deduction. It will eliminate state and local tax deductions on income. It will restrict the mortgage interest deduction. It is estimated that 47 million taxpayers face a tax hike. Almost half of any tax cuts will go to the richest 1%. Residents of my state, California, will face the largest net tax increase, totaling $12.1 billion in 2027 alone. Mr. Speaker and members, I call on the President of the United States of America to show his tax income, to show his tax plan. He needs to let us know what he's all about and what his taxes are. From the very beginning, he said he couldn't show them at the time that he was asked when he was first inaugurated into this presidency. But time has passed. It's time for the president to show us his tax returns rather than coming up with a tax scam, asking everybody else to pay up, to pay more, and saying that this is a middle-class tax cut when it is not. We want to know more about him and his plan. And so with that, my 1 minute, my 2 minutes, whatever it is this evening, is all about saying a message to the president. Even though I will be cautioned that I'm not to talk to the president, I'm calling on the president, show your tax returns.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's a message for California's 43rd District, and that is a benefit of $1,395 if H.R. 1 is passed into law. With that, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Peoria, Illinois, Mr. LaHood.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Illinois for his commitment and dedication to this terrific bill that we have before the House tonight. Madam Speaker, the people of Illinois are unfortunately all too familiar with high taxes and the burden they put on families and our local businesses. At the federal level, things have become just as bad, with a tax code that is over 74,000 pages long and riddled with loopholes. Over 30 years have passed since the last time Congress passed comprehensive tax reform. And you can see the effects of our outdated tax code everywhere. We have stagnant hiring,
stagnant wages, and a stagnant economy that is holding back our middle class instead of helping them get ahead. H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, is our chance to change all of this by simplifying our tax code and bringing real relief to everyday families. We can once again jumpstart the American economy and get it back to working for the middle class. The choice before us is a simple one. Do we support this bill and support the middle class, or do we embrace the status quo? That is why I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come together and vote for this bill. Let's send a signal that we don't stand for the status quo. We stand for growth and economic opportunity for the American people. Let us bring relief to the middle class. Support this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Selma, Alabama, attorney and Marshall Scholar, Congresswoman Sewell.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, our tax code is a statement of our values, and I can tell you that this tax bill doesn't reflect my value nor those of the American people. This bill favors the wealthy over the middle class. It favors corporations over the working families, and it favors special interests over everyday Americans. Mr. Speaker, this bill raises taxes for 36 million middle-class Americans, and it cashes a check for $2.3 trillion worth of debt that will be left to our children and grandchildren. This tax bill gives permanent tax cuts for the corporations and multinationals while making the tax cuts for regular taxpayers temporary. This tax bill preserves tax deductions for certain industries but does away with tax cuts in the code that help everyday Americans. It eliminates the deduction for state and local taxes. It also limits mortgage interest deduction, and it limits the medical expense deduction affecting 9 million households. The independent group, the Tax Policy Center, estimates that almost half of the tax cuts, 47% of the tax cuts, will go to the top 1%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill devastates education. Education, which is truly the investment in our human capital, our workforce. It eliminates deductions for interest on student loans. It eliminates deductions for teachers who buy supplies. It eliminates lifetime learning credits, and it eliminates employer tuition assistance. This bill adds a special tax on the endowments of colleges and universities, which will reduce scholarships and increase the cost of college for average, everyday Americans. Cities and towns will be decimated by this bill. This bill eliminates tax incentives such as the private activity bonds, the new market tax credits, and the historic tax credits, which dramatically affect the ability to build libraries, hospitals, to fund roads and bridges and broadband infrastructure. These are critical investments, Mr. Speaker, in the public service that spur economic growth. Mr. Speaker, this tax bill has it backwards. This Congress should value its constituents first. Not Wall Street, not special interests, its constituents first. I urge my colleagues to vote against this tax bill because it doesn't represent the values that our constituents sent us here to this hollow place, Congress, to represent. We should be representing them and not the special interests. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself 30 seconds to just do a quick little cleanup. There was a discussion a minute ago by the gentlelady from Alabama where she was talking about teachers, for example. Well, let's get right to that. Teachers won't be harmed by shifting the status quo because what they're getting right now is a $250 deduction, which is worth about $37 at the 15% tax rate, receipts that they got to keep all year long and keep in an envelope and apply it at the end in terms of doing their taxes. And we say, dump that. Let's get away from that. Let's double their standard deduction, lower their rates, and give them some real money. And with that, I yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady from California and ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Texas control the remainder of the time on our side.
Without objection, and the gentlelady from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise to engage the gentleman from Texas in a colloquy. Madam Speaker, tax reform will result in economic growth across the country, especially in my home state of California. I thank the gentleman for his dedication to this important effort. Madam Speaker, my home state is uniquely positioned in this tax debate. Due to the liberal tax and spend policies enacted by the California State Legislature, my district in Orange County is one of the most expensive places to live in this country. California has the highest personal income tax rate in the country, reaching a crushing 12.3%. The median home price in my district is almost $800,000. California also has the highest gas tax in the country. While this bill is important reforms that will grow our economy, I have serious concerns that some of my constituents may be worse off. As Sacramento continues to confiscate more and more of California's hard-earned paychecks, we must ensure that Washington does not put similar tax burdens on our constituents. I ask the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee to assure me that we will ensure that individuals and families in my district are protected from such unintended outcomes. I yield my time to my friend from California, Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, if you want to demonize or scare people, you come down on the floor and you yell and scream and raise your hands and you say things that they haven't looked into. So what I did was I talked to people in my district and I looked at their rates and I said, let's look at your taxes. And kind of worked them through, and I found that people in the lower income rate in my district got relief. People in the middle income got relief right across the board. Everyone we kept talking to, this happened. So I would say before you come down and yell and scream and try and scare people on something you might have heard on a talking head, actually work with your people. It works. So, Mr. Chairman, if this bill is enacted, it will result in economic growth across the country, and especially in my home state of California. The lowered rates for individuals, families, and businesses, and the tax simplicity and certainly offered by this bill will provide net tax relief to the middle class and our country's job creators. We expect this bill to create nearly 1 million jobs nationwide, and nearly 10% of those in California. While the bill makes commendable strides toward a fairer, simpler tax code, I am concerned about how the bill could impact some of my constituents as a result of the high level of income taxes imposed on them by our state government. I would ask the chairman of Ways and Means can assure me that we continue our work and ensure the families in my district are protected from such unintended consequences, and that they will be able to fully enjoy the benefits of this bill. And I yield back to the gentlelady.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I will yield.
So I want to thank both of you for stepping forward to being such strong advocates for taxpayers in a state that taxes its families and businesses, I think, almost beyond belief. Our goal in tax reform is to achieve tax relief for families and individuals across the country, regardless of where you live, and across all incomes, while at the same time unleashing the economic engine of American economic growth. California, by the way, under tax reform, is the #1 job creator under a new tax code. So I agree with the gentleman and gentlelady. There are still some areas where we want to make and will make improvements in this bill. And if you will work with us to continue to move this process forward, I'm happy to commit to working with both of you to ensure we reach a positive outcome for your constituents and your families as we reconcile our differences with the Senate. And I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. 33% of Mr. Knight's constituents derive a $16,000 annual benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. In the case of the gentlelady, 37% of her constituents enjoy an $18,200 mortgage interest deduction benefit. Now, it's my intention to close if there are no more speakers on the other side.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More than anything else, Madam Speaker, this is, as I opened with, a missed opportunity. We all know what's wrong with this tax code. We could have found areas of compromise emphasizing the middle class and middle income earners. We understand that the tax code that American corporations use is not competitive now internationally, but we wanted some relief for middle income people. So here's where the investment could have taken place. We could have begun an investment in human capital. You've heard it tonight. Labor participation rates in America, we all should be alarmed by. what's happened in the post-war period, where at one time it was 66% and now it's 63.8%. It's about technology, it's about globalization for sure, but it's also about skill set. 18,000 precision manufacturing jobs in New England go unanswered, the smallest geographic region of the country. The Department of Labor reported this week 6 million jobs in America go unanswered. It's part of a skill set issue. And you know what else we need to be concerned about? 2 million people in America are addicted to opiates. That's what we should be concerned about, and getting them back into the workplace through the trampoline effect, where they hit it and they bounce back up into the mainstream. But that's not what we did. Without any hearings, without any chance for the minority to participate in any terms of substance, we move forward. I want to say to the last two speakers, they're sincere enough. We've heard now 4 different people come to the well of this House on the other side and say to the chairperson of our committee and a friend, are you going to fix this after the bill leaves here? 4 different people asked for a fix, and I want to tell you, based on long experience in this House, the path gets more narrow as it leaves this House. It doesn't grow more expansive. It will be harder to fix these things because of the budget score that was embraced. So in 2001, we were promised widespread economic growth when President Bush took the Clinton surplus and offered $1.3 trillion worth of tax cuts. And when you look at the distribution tables, they were right about one thing. Everybody did get a tax cut. But then you look at those tables and you say, let me examine who got what. And then in 2003, we came back and the president proposed $1 trillion worth of tax cuts based on the premise of economic growth, which didn't happen. And by the way, in 2004, maybe the granddaddy of them all, repatriation. Well, we're going to repatriate at 5.25% those holdings offshore on the premise of job growth. And there was none. We had this opportunity to do this together. Understanding, as I described with worker participation rates, understanding that because of most families now not having large numbers of children any longer, this should have been about immigration reform as well attached to it. We all know skilled workers from overseas are going to be an important part of the American economy, and we should be embracing that along with sensible tax policies based upon some relief for the middle class. So instead, we are taking away the ability of American students to deduct interest on their loans to pay for a tax cut for people at the top. We're taking away a medical expense deduction for people who have Alzheimer's disease to pay for a tax cut for people at the top. We are assessing universities and colleges now a new special tax to pay for tax cuts for people at the top. We could have had this conversation. We acknowledge what President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill did, because it was based upon goodwill and commonality and not needing just a political victory. So day after day, they plowed through with 450 witnesses in front of the Ways and Means Committee. How many witnesses did we have in front of the Ways and Means Committee? 0. How many hearings did we have on this tax bill? 0. We saw the manager's amendment and were given 20 minutes to review it. And I don't mean 25 minutes, I mean 20 minutes. Back to regular order. We should scrap this bill, and to those that are vulnerable on the other side, I would not be trusting of the idea that these issues are going to be fixed after you cast this vote tomorrow morning. There will be an opportunity to go back and redo this if the other side would say, let's find a meaningful path to cooperation between the two parties. That's all we're asking for on this side. Include us in this discussion so we might invest in community colleges, vocational education, internship programs, skill set training, and answer the call of globalization. We still do innovation and creativity that far surpasses the rest of the world. Nothing we can't answer in America without those healthy investments that we need. Instead, when you look at these distribution tables that are proposed as to who's going to get what, taking away alternative minimum tax for the 4.5 million families that pay it, and asking students to give up their student interest deduction, the estate tax, and we're repealing it, and asking that loved one who has Alzheimer's that is being cared for at home to give up that medical deduction to pay for all of that? It makes no sense whatsoever. But there is an opportunity, Madam Speaker, to reverse course. In my years here, I can tell you this. Anybody who thinks that the Senate, the United States Senate, is going to accommodate the wishes when they see the goalpost and the goal line of a handful of members of this House, they're making a miscalculation. So we've heard tonight they're going to do something about mortgage interest deduction. They're going to do something about the historic tax credit. They're going to revisit some of these issues. Do you know how difficult that's going to be, Madam Speaker? That's going to be near impossible. And on top of that, they're going to go back and try to repeal the Affordable Care Act again and take 13 million people away from their insurance so that we can have a tax cut that further concentrates wealth for a handful of people in America. This is the House of Representatives, Madam Speaker, not the House of Lords. We don't serve here by peerage. We are not entitled to anything here. Most of us come from pretty modest backgrounds. That's the principle we should be honoring in this tax debate as we discuss who's about to pay what and who the rewards ought to be for the hardworking men and women. And the last note I'm going to express before I yield back my time. What about those 1 million veterans who have served us honorably in Iraq and Afghanistan? New veterans. What about them? Are we going to eventually cut their benefits with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and put it all in the chopping block as we attempt to further concentrate wealth in America, particularly for unearned income, by the way? That's where we're headed. We should honor the skills of those men and women who every day get up and strive and work hard in this country with a sense of purpose and great patriotism. And that's what we should be acknowledging in this debate. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow morning when we conclude this debate and spend the 2 hours discussing more of what we've witnessed here tonight. And there will be more than enough enthusiasm on our side. They'll be lined up to RFK Stadium to participate tomorrow morning in this debate. That's how important this is to the future of the American people. And with that, Madam Speaker, thanks for your courtesy, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserve his time? Does the gentleman reserve his time? Gentleman reserves.
I think I'm out of time, Madam Speaker, but thank you.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, Washington is just hilarious. You know, lawmakers back home tell everyone they're for tax reform until it comes actually time to do it. Everyone says they want a fair, flatter, simpler tax code as long as you keep every special interest provision in this big, fat, messed up tax code. Everyone says they want to give people back more of what they earn and get Main Street businesses going as long as you don't change anything in the tax code. As long as the lobbyists win, the American people lose, you know, they're willing to talk about it. Well, House Republicans are actually acting on tax reform for the first time in 31 years. And in Washington, you know, they sneer at that family of four back home making $59,000 a year. That's, you know, that's the average household. And under our tax reform, they pay less, $1,182 less that they keep in their pocket. Washington makes fun of that. That's real money for families. That firefighter making $48,000 a year keeps over $1,300. That single mom, you know, working hard every day, making $30,000 a year, she has $700 larger refund than she gets today. And that Main Street startup business working I don't know how many hours, making $62,000 a year. That was my Chamber of Commerce member right there. That startup business, they keep $3,007 more than they do today. Washington just laughs at that. But it's real money for real people. In my district, my family of four making $90,000, that's two teachers, keeps $2,176 more every year of their life from this. And my friends on the Democrat side, now they worry about the debt. But I remember, first year Democrats took control of the House, they doubled the deficit. The second year, they tripled it. Third year, it went to $1 trillion, and it stayed that way until the American people gave the House back to Republicans. So they loved spending money and raising the deficit when they let Washington grow. But when it's time to grow jobs and paychecks, all of a sudden they're worried about the debt. The truth of the matter is we want to keep this debt and deficits going. Don't change anything. Keep this slow growth economy. Keep spending. Guarantee your debts will grow, deficits grow. We're talking about growing jobs, growing paychecks, and getting back to a balanced budget by getting this economy moving in a big way. At the end of the day, it is time to end the status quo in Washington, D.C. Americans deserve a fair, flatter tax code, one that closes loopholes and ends special interest deductions so Americans can keep more of what they earn, so their paychecks can rise, so our businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world, especially here at home in America. And it's time our jobs start coming back to America rather than watching them go. Our jobs, our research, our manufacture, our patents, our headquarters, that era is over. And it starts with H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We will continue this debate tomorrow, Madam Speaker, so we'll continue to deliver tax reform and tax cuts for the American people. With that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 1 is postponed.